Mal Fletcher is a social commentator and futurist. Morning to you, Mal.
Morning, Phil.
Would you? I don't know how old you are. Would you regard yourself as old? How old are you?
I'm 56. I don't think I'm old. My mother's a lot older than me, and she's still going strong, so no, I don't feel that old.
How old is old, then?
Well, I think these days that's changing a lot. I think probably with, life expectancy because of advances in medicine and so on, it's growing, it's climbing, so we do tend to change, and cultures have always changed the way they see old. I mean, there was a time about 1,000 years ago when people were old when they reached about 35. So by that token, you and I are both ancient, I guess. But I think Professor Beard is right in the sense that mistaking old for anachronistic or out of touch or irrelevant is a huge mistake, and it robs us of one of our most precious resources as a culture, which is the wisdom, the perspective, the insight of elderly family members and friends. And in part, I think, Phil, our reliance on digital text these days means that we're arguably becoming more addicted to novelty, to the idea that only the latest model's worth having. We need to constantly trade up to the new and the shiny. And sometimes we carry, I think, some of that thinking into the way we treat people. And again, we miss the perspective that older folks can give us.
Okay, we take all of that, but let's think about what we mean then. Because do you think that we I wonder if we mean different things when we think about old? Because, I mean, you had difficulty there in deciding where to put a figure on it. When we talk about someone being old, are we talking about a chronological age, do you think? Or are we talking about an attitude? Are we talking about an image? What are we talking about?
Well, I think it's all of those things. I think predominantly, though, we tend to associate it with someone who's been around for a long time. And when you're 20, old can mean 45,
yes,
or 50. When you're 50, it becomes more like 70, and so on.
So isn't old then essentially older than me?
Yeah, it's a relative term to some degree, but I think there does come a point where people say, if you're in your 70s or 80s today, you would be considered to be old, because we don't much like to think about that period. It's almost, I would define it this way: someone who is old is close to what comes next, and we don't like to think about what comes next.
This is. I think you're absolutely right there. I think this is why we don't like old. I know that's certainly why I'm in denial, because once you start talking about being old, you're starting to think about death, and then that all gets a bit grim.
Yeah, it does, and you're probably right. I think it's interesting too that the Eastern cultures, 10 or 15, 20 years ago, we used to say, well, the East can teach us a lot about caring for the elderly. But because perhaps of globalization, that respect for age is breaking down there too. I was reading in Japan recently, many elderly care facilities now use what they call emotive smart robots to offer quote-unquote empathy to their clientele. And it's strange to see that the clientele are actually saying they prefer these robotic, quote, carers to the human variety. So even there, that sense of caring for the elderly is breaking down, and I think that's a bit of a tragedy.
Part of what Professor Beard says, she said, complimenting someone for not looking their age, she says, is one of the weirdest double things in our culture. Is she right? Because this feeds into this whole, not only do we not want to be old, but we want to be young.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody would be totally thrilled. Anybody I know anyway who is in their 70s or 80s or even older would be totally thrilled for you to say you really look your age today. It's not the sort of thing that does sound like a compliment. I mean,
isn't that her point, though? Her point is that we need to rethink the baggage or the associations that come with the word.
Yeah, but I think there's other ways to celebrate people. I think that we can sell it rather than how they look. I think we can celebrate the wisdom they give us. Some of them have a great sense of fun and a twinkle in the eye, and we can respond to that. I like watching elderly, very old people when you say to them, "You look so good," or "You're looking younger every time I see you." Now they know that that's probably a bit of flattery, but there's a smile in the eye when you say it most of the time. So I don't think there's anything pejorative about that.
Here's the thing. Les has just called the show. Thank you, Les. And Les says he doesn't like to use the word old to describe people. It feels offensive.
Well, it may do. I don't know that. I don't know. I'm not old. As I said, I don't feel old myself. But I think people, it's a very subjective thing, whether you feel threatened by the word old. I think that we should elevate, and Professor Beard is right in this sense, elevate the word old to mean experienced and wise and having perspective. When we see the word old differently, using the word doesn't become such a problem.
I wonder if a part of it is to do with the way the English language works, because we don't like short, sharp words. Old, fat. I'm trying to think of others that describe a certain thing, but just because they sound a bit like, they just sound offensive.
Well, they do to our politically correct ears, I think, and that's another thing we have to take into account. We've sort of gone through this era of being ultra-sensitive to what we say, and in doing that at times, we've sort of gone too far. We've bent over too far to sound less offensive, to the point where words become, they cease to have any positive meaning at all. So I don't think the word old is an offensive word. I think we need to load it with a different kind of meaning, where once we would have done, we don't so much now.
Okay. Good to talk to you, Mal. Thank you. Mal Fletcher is a social commentator and futurist. Are you old? Is being old... And how old is old? How old are you when you start being old?